Alright, so we are back to music history. This one's going to be picking up where the last one ended off, right at the end of the Romantic period. And for this one, I'm going to be going to about the end of the 20th century. Now, the way I'm going to structure these is for this one, I'm going to talk about where those elements of the earlier Western tradition ended up as we get into the 20th century, but we'll be mentioning new elements that come in, like the blues tradition. So I'll be focusing primarily on that more direct lineage and making videos later that go into more detail on things like the blues tradition or certain world musics that enter into electronic music. So you'll notice that while I'm discussing the mid and late 20th centuries, there will be many massive genres that I don't mention. I will get to those and talk about all of the elements that they draw inspiration from, but they're going to need separate videos to really go into. So we left off in the tail end of Romanticism, where there's a certain magic in the air, there's more sentimental sensibilities, and music is becoming a lot more romantic. Now, one thing that we see quite a lot of in the 19th century is warfare, very grand-scale warfare that hadn't been seen quite like this since the 30 Years' War. In the early 19th century, Napoleon just sweeps across Europe. And just going back to the 18th century, we had the Holy Roman Empire as a very foundational structure of Europe. But throughout the 19th century, and really quite notably with Frederick the Great, the king in Prussia, we see Brandenburg, Prussia, turn into the vast, powerful kingdom of Prussia, eventually forming groundwork for the German Empire. And as Britain's empire expands around the world, and as France and Germany get into even more conflicts, particularly the Franco-Prussian War, we see a real increase in militarism and military energy across Europe. And this is all going on during the Romantic period, and going on before World War I. So there's a real romantic quality. These militaries are seen with a real sense of heroic adventure, since the continent hadn't had to really face the horrors of the likes of the world wars. It wasn't guys dying of disease in muddy trenches yet. At this point it was still cavalry charges and grand splendor. Now, there have been military music and marches for a long time, but here, particularly in the late 19th century, we begin to see military music really take on a new life in that era of great romantic, heroic imagery. And increasingly, the military marching band becomes more of a staple. Marches had been common in Europe for a while, but never really made their way into Baroque or classical music the way they began to at this point. And elements of marches can be seen in composers like Wagner or Brahms. But one man more than anyone else really pushed the march forward, and that was John Philip Sousa. He was the leader of the U.S. Marine Corps Band, and he brought what could really be said to be a French style of march into the United States in a significant way. They were fast, very high energy, had a strong beat and strong brass. And while we still have military marching bands today, it was really a period of incredible development and national pride during the 19th century. There were real romantic and cultural sensibilities that were wrapped up in this music. And across the West, you could see this military marching band influence with military wind band styles in the modern classical of artists like Maurice Ravel, or the British composer Gustav Holst, whose tune from his work The Planets in the 1920s would become a British patriotic song, I Vow to Thee, My Country. One thing that's really significant about military marches in this time is that romantic music was very often very variable in its speed. It was very sentimental and could often be very soft and quiet, or could be extremely forceful, but was quite often the sort of music that would be sat and listened to. Now, there was absolutely dance music at this time, but something that really stands out about the march is just how steady and strong the beat was. Driving drum and bass constantly kept you on the pulse. And that constant, very heavy beat is something that we see quite a lot today. It is really ubiquitous in modern music. Ah, vaudeville. That's where you go. That's where the show is. That's where the big bucks are. I'm telling you. Show business. You'll be rich as Rockefeller, the wealthiest man alive in this current year. So I've grouped vaudeville and music hall together, and functionally it's reasonable to consider them as parallel phenomena, but there are some subtle differences. Vaudeville is primarily an American phenomenon, and it takes its name from French theater, vaudeville, which is the voice of the city. And it was primarily entertainment theater. And you would go and you'd see a series of different acts. Over time, these shows became more structured, and companies of multiple acts would begin traveling together from theater to theater. Some shows could be clean, others might not, and it was really this cultural explosion over decades that grew into this enormous theater phenomenon. Music hall was a very similar phenomenon in Britain, as well as other parts of Europe. Very often these would be theaters where people would come and have food and drinks. It would be a variety of shows performed during a meal, and very often there would be dancing and bars as well. This forms the basis for what would be termed variety theater. And there were some differences in the types of shows that would be performed in British music hall versus American vaudeville, but they emerged around the same time and they filled a pretty similar niche. Vaudeville performers, termed vaudevillians, went from being smaller troupes of touring performers into members of an enormous nation-spanning phenomenon. And vaudeville made its way into all parts of the country. There were small-town theaters, there were performances that would be mostly aimed toward middle-class families. There would be larger urban theaters, there would be some that would be much more adult. And there were elements of the romantic music of the time, there were folk musical elements, and elements of the march music. But something else that it offered was the possibility for new immigrants to get rich. It was very common to see Irish, Italian, Polish, Jewish, German immigrants in these shows. And a lot of their acts were geared towards making fun of themselves. But something else it also did was allowed for styles of art from around Europe to be shared and blended into a new thing in these theaters. Now, beginning really in the late 19th century, there's one musical style I absolutely have to mention, and that's ragtime. Now, you very likely have heard ragtime, but if you're not sure if you have, I'm going to give an example from the most significant ragtime artist of all time, and that is Scott Joplin. Now, Scott is easily one of the most prolific ragtime composers ever, and certainly the most significant. Ragtime over time became to be more associated with places like saloons and more comic theater, but he wrote it to be classical music. His intentions for his music were for it to fit into the romantic classical style and to be performed in the same venues. So here's a bit of a very well-known example of his music, published in 1899. It's really fun. Ragtime really fully formed by the 1890s, but its formation could really be seen as far back as the 1870s and 80s, with earlier precursor styles as far back as the 1860s. Going back to the march music from earlier, it took a lot of that rhythmic pulse influence from there. There was a pretty strong, reliable pulse, typically in 4/4 or 2/4, although there were waltz forms of it written in 3. But despite having that march influence, it does something a little bit odd. Its time is ragged, hence ragtime. And this refers to a syncopation that is ubiquitous throughout the style. Its strong accents generally occur between the beats. And the style began to really catch on in vaudeville. In fact, it was in vaudeville where the term ragtime was first coined. It had a strong beat, fun syncopation, very often was written for just one piano, which made it very easy to have performed, and was very often made up of repeated phrases or themes. It was the perfect sort of music to play in a live theater. And here's where we start to see something really interesting. Instead of just moving through time with the Western tradition, starting now, we begin to see the influence of multiple traditions on the emerging styles. As much as it was influenced by romantic music and marches, many of its elements, particularly its rhythmic elements, can be traced back to plantation songs. There are also elements that overlap with Caribbean styles. We'll definitely see the West African tradition begin to become more prominent once we get to the next section, talking about jazz and swing. But looking at the historic timeline, this period really stands out as the beginning of hybridization of West African-derived field song and Western European classical, a trend which really picked up in the 20th century. As time went on into the 19 teens and 20s, vaudeville began to decline. Much of those music styles themselves remained and were enormously popular, but the performance of vaudeville shows themselves began to fade away. Films were beginning to be produced, and people wanted to see those, and that took up a lot of the market for vaudeville shows. I will note, however, that much of that same music that was being used in the vaudeville shows became used in film, and especially in silent films. Radio and the personal ownership of radios really pushed vaudeville down a lot further. Now people were watching films, and people were listening to their radios. It didn't seem like vaudeville could compete. And by the 1930s, with the Great Depression, it was done. People just weren't going out to see the shows anymore. But that music just kept evolving. So, do you like jazz? The main problem with jazz is that it's actually a really vague term. You could talk about something like hard bop or modal jazz or free jazz, and there's something pretty clear you're talking about, but jazz itself is a pretty vague term. But yet we still know jazz when we hear it, even if there's always going to be some guy who says, that's not real jazz. To really begin getting into jazz, I first have to talk about blues. Blues begins its formation in the mid-19th century and really comes into its full form in the 20th century. Originally, its elements come from West African and Caribbean tradition. The progenitors of what would become blues were spirituals, chants, work songs, and traditional African religious music. And after the era of slavery had ended, the new communities that formed played music amongst themselves, taking the music of plantations and turning it into what would become blues. Now, one really big defining feature of blues is the blue note. And there's no super clean way to describe a blue note. It's a note that's just a bit flatter than it should be. It might be a half step, but it might not even be an entire half step. In 12-tet, blue notes could be microtonal. And one thing that blue notes do that's really core to blues is that it allows for some modal and key ambiguity. A generally more major sounding song could have this ambiguous, heavier minor sound get into it. Now, over time, particularly in the South, and quite notably in New Orleans, where there was a very large amount of Haitian influence, this style grew, developed, and evolved. It began to take on other influences, like the music from vaudeville, Western classical, march music. There's a reasonable argument to be made that ragtime, at least in some forms, could be an early type of jazz. But that's not a universally accepted categorization, just an interesting avenue for debate. The music in these clubs became more and more popular, more and more nationwide. Soon the entire United States was listening to this new mix of sounds. Even marching bands were performing it, and the instrumentation of marching bands would become key to setting the instrumentation that would make up the jazz band of the next decades. And then it happens. We're not in the anything else age anymore. We're in the jazz age. Beginning in the 1920s and really through the 1940s, we see this explosion of jazz. This association of styles really comes into a full form. Jazz. But not like that yet. By the 1920s, we begin to see the emergence of big band music, where very large jazz bands would perform, sometimes in very large venues, but still mostly it was a club phenomenon. And it's during these decades that we begin to see jazz expand into Europe as well. In the 1920s, we begin to see significant artists like Cab Calloway. In the 1930s, Duke Ellington. And the 40s, Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk. Amongst really an enormous group of names. Now, one thing that's really key at this point is the notion of swing. And this is a style that really gets big in the 1920s, and especially by the 30s. And it's essentially a swinging feel of the time. Right here I have two eighth notes. If we were to play that normally, it would sound like an eighth note, and then an eighth note. However, when swung, they're not given equal time and emphasis, turning a 1-2, 1-2, 1-2 into a 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, like this. And the music at this time is something that could be elaborated on to an enormous degree. There are many jazz documentaries out there that go into incredible depth. But just continuing on with our timeline, by the time the jazz age ends and we enter the post-war era, music begins to change. Jazz is still certainly alive and well, but it doesn't have that incredible dominance it once had. Other genres begin to pop up, and jazz, while still very much alive, begins to shoot off into all sorts of different directions, forming new subgenres. The post-war period had a pretty substantial mood shift. Beginning to form in the late 1940s, but really emerging in the 1950s, we get a new high-energy, youthful style, rock and roll. It's generally pretty loud, more simple, very high energy, very exciting, and it's really perfect youth music for the time. There was certainly blues inspiration in rock and roll, but now the jazz band was being replaced by Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, the Big Bopper. Hello, baby. Yes, this is the Big Bopper speaking. Roy Orbison and Buddy Holly. Facilitated by much expanded record sales and increasing TV performances. Rock and roll artists were really notable in their sheer commercial success. And this shift really was most concentrated as a youth phenomenon. In the 1950s, teenagers for the first time had disposable income, and they could go out and buy records. It was a period that had a lot of optimism and excitement. Those are some sort of joy-filled days. Sunday, Monday, joy-filled days. Tuesday, Wednesday, joy-filled days. And for teenagers, this high-energy, exciting music was the perfect soundtrack. The young soundtrack to a youthful culture. As the 50s rolled into the 60s, new pop genres began to emerge. The style was typically for small band, most often electric guitar-led, and simple in structure. The themes typically revolved around fun, youthful activities, particularly driving, as there was an enormous car culture growing amongst teenagers at this point. A lot of it was themed around young love and romance. You know, the sorts of things you think about when you're a teen. Yeah, rock and roll music was mostly about those sorts of things. Well, except for this one weird little stretch where there were a lot of songs about sudden tragic death. But other than that, I mean. And pretty quickly, subgenres began to emerge as well. One very notable one being rockabilly, incorporating more American country elements into rock and roll, with notable figures like Johnny Cash and Jerry Lee Lewis. Now, this was mostly an American phenomenon, but it did begin to make its way into Europe. And one very important place it made its way was the United Kingdom. I have heard so many references to the pirate radio station Radio Caroline from English musicians. In the 1960s, the BBC wouldn't broadcast rock and pop music too often. Occasionally, continental radio could be heard, but pirate radio stations like this, which broadcast off a ship off the coast, helped to give rock and roll and the emerging pop coming out of it a presence in the United Kingdom. And the British made their own. The British developed their own form of rock and pop, with distinct British character. Now, while this happened across all of the United Kingdom, it primarily was concentrated in England. However, a folk revival which occurred shortly thereafter would notably feature Scotland. Significant music acts came from across Europe in this style, but Britain had an outsized impact on the United States, taking the American music and returning it with a new English style.
Back when we started out, we was a skiffle band.
But I'm sure that went nowhere.
To get out of your head, you gotta go out of your mind. A whole new way of consciousness. That's what this offers. You've gotta first turn on, then tune in, and then most importantly, drop out.
That's it. I've cornered the market on Timothy Leary impressions. Remember all those kids and teenagers in the last bit? How fun and sweet and innocent it was? Well, that's done now. They were now doing whatever this is. The post-war era had been very safe and prosperous, but also the creativity was diminished, and the now teenagers and young adults became inventive, explorational, and rebellious. In the mid-1960s, led by beat figures like Neil Cassidy and Ken Kesey, began a wild, jovial, and colorful cultural wave coming from the West Coast, while simultaneously on the East Coast, a more academic and intellectual counterpart began to emerge, offering a new age spiritual and perhaps a touch hedonistic approach to life. And the CIA was doing something. But it was fine. It was fine. Young artists began to develop musical styles emerging from beat music in New York and Los Angeles, concentrating in San Francisco as psychedelic music. Simultaneously, a folk revival was underway. Now, this was the tail end of a folk revival that really began in the 1940s. With artists like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. And while by the 1960s that main wave of folk revival was coming to an end, many of its remaining elements were morphing into the youth culture, with artists like Peter Paul and Mary, Joan Baez, and perhaps most notably, Bob Dylan. And the United Kingdom was undergoing something similar concurrently, and by the 1960s you began to see something like the Scottish folk hippie Donovan. And with this new cultural energy, this folk music, and increasingly San Francisco and London-derived sounds, mid-60s pop music became something different. It became psychedelic. And these sorts of goofy young guys in suits became, colorful psychedelic Edwardian military band, I suppose. In this cultural zeitgeist, musicians began experimenting with all sorts of new sounds. Those fun teenagers who were writing about surfing let Brian Wilson take the wheel and write for the theremin. They used the theremin. And similar scenes emerged in Britain, primarily concentrated in London and Birmingham. Artists like the Beatles, The Doors, Grateful Dead, Beach Boys, Pink Floyd, Moody Blues, and Jimi Hendrix were just going wild, using all sorts of odd sound, feedback, gain, odd instruments, world music elements, and even playing sound backward to give a psychedelic effect. Also, on the topic of Jimi Hendrix, I have this whole theory that he lived with George Handel's ghost, but I don't have to do that right now. And underlying all of this artistic development was the concept of psychedelia, the artistic manifestation of the psychedelic or mind-manifesting state, particularly brought about owing to the synthesis and proliferation of LSD. And maybe someone else? It all just sounded very colorful and sometimes even trance-like, attempting to capture an altered psychic spiritual state, deep in the mind where you see that we're all one and life flows on within you and without you. And for that, we have to credit a lot of advancements in recording technique. During this time, there was a rapid expansion in what could be done in the studio. Advancements like 8-track recording doubled the amount of tracks that could be on a record. The ability to play tapes in reverse, automatic double tracking, and variable speed recording allowed for all sorts of new experimentation with sound. Not to mention new instruments. The mellotron became enormously popular at the time, allowing for recordings of different instruments to be played as a keyboard. In the late 1960s, Robert Moog's synthesizers made their way into studios, and various instruments from around the world began to be played in Western music. Eventually, though, this cultural wave began to get tired, and people began to look less favorably on it, because of some obvious reasons. But bands like the Moody Blues, Pink Floyd, and King Crimson stayed around, and began to come up with a whole new thing. began to get pretty sick of what was going on in the 60s, so a whole new thing came along. And the 70s were great. Everyone had a fantastic time. To many people, it seemed like the post-war high of the good times were over. And with a gas shortage, economic slowdown, inflation, or, later on, high interest rates, heightened geopolitical risk, all while coming off of the excesses of the hippies, the music abandoned the naive excitement of the 60s and became more subtle and introspective. And this is where we see progressive rock come in. Now, there's a divergence of many new genres during this time, but I want to focus on progressive rock or prog rock because it has the most direct lineage to the psychedelic music that preceded it. In comparison to psychedelic music, it was much more mature and thoughtful. It was also much more sophisticated and complex. It could get very technical. During this era, elements of Western classical became much more heavy, often including lush orchestrations. World music, folk, and even Renaissance elements made its way in. And coupled with this was a rise of electronic music. Although the use of early synthesizers had begun as far back as the 1950s, the Moog really made its way in a heavy way in the 1970s. In many ways, it was a sort of intellectual art rock movement, and the themes became increasingly heavy and philosophical. Music became a whole lot less, with the power of our love we will save the world, let's go live on the party bus. And a whole lot more, can I even know my own mind, what if I'm just insane and this is all a delusion, This era saw artists like Pink Floyd, King Crimson, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and yes, indeed, it did also include Yes. And this style was really concentrated in the 70s, although some artists like Styx and ELO would continue on later with a more simplified poppy version of the genre. Disclaimer, I'm going to be talking about hard rock and metal now. Now I'll be doing this in a very general sense, but I know how people get. So please don't fight me on quote what real sludge metal is. This is not what this is about. Now in thinking about the best way to introduce this, I figure going back to the 60s is the best way. And I'm going to use Black Sabbath as what I think is the best example. So earlier we talked about how people got pretty sick of hippies. Well, at that time, beginning really in the early 70s, we began to see a contra-hippie style emerge. Now, early on, to an extent, Black Sabbath were in that milieu of hippies, but as time went on, they really formed as a contra-hippie phenomenon. And this was before punks really emerged, so there's this gap of certainly not hippie, but not punk yet. And this is where a lot of the groundwork gets laid for hard rock and metal. In the late 60s and early 70s, we begin to see artists like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, and they have a much louder and heavier sound, and you can hear in their music that it's still very heavily a blues-based style. And throughout the 70s, this louder, heavier style began to be developed in different directions. Artists like Alice Cooper took it in a heavier, darker, and more edgy direction. Artists like Van Halen took it in a faster and more virtuosic direction, while groups like Kiss made it bright and flashy and showy. And in the mid-1970s, you began to see artists who were going away from that loud blues sound and starting to converge on some other more experimental outsider sounds. And you started to see the evolution of a punk sound seeping into the genre. Now, the origin of this punk sound isn't super easy to pinpoint, but beginning in the late 1960s, there was a anti-corporate, anti-mainstream sentiment that was circulating in some experimental music. I have shown here the Velvet Underground, since that's a really good contender for one of the earlier examples. Bands like the Stooges were influenced by the sounds of the 1960s, particularly people like Jimi Hendrix, but began to become disillusioned with it, and began to build up the punk sound that developed into the 70s. This was a much heavier sound, one that was very raw and direct, and used a lot of power chords. And then by the mid-70s, you begin to see artists like the Ramones. So now on the one hand, you have this heavy blues style that's been evolving through the 70s, and this punk style that's now really coming into form. And artists do what artists do and influence each other. And now armed with this mix of sounds, bands like Motley Crue began to emerge out of the glam metal that was circulating, while the edgier underground elements began to produce bands like Metallica. And steadily into the 80s, this heavy sound just began to dominate. And here, beginning particularly in the mid to late 80s, all sorts of subgenres began to emerge, each with all sorts of different subcultures associated. Some express nihilistic and hedonistic themes. Some are highly anarchic and rebellious. Some used grand and gothic imagery, while others blended traditional styles and had pagan and folk imagery. Some formed straight-edge movements. Some were socialists and communists. Some even wrote dungeon synth and became anarcho-primitivists in the woods. This went in so many different directions, and that's why I made that disclaimer earlier. And another thing that's worth pointing out is just how much classical and folk influence was in there. And this collection of genres has really continued to morph to today. Punk shooting off into new genres like emo, or even forming into pop-punk bands. While newer forms of metal like nu metal, and really just an unlimited amount of subgenres have been developed. Well, there's part 2, and that's the end of this very broad timeline beginning in the modern era. And there are a lot of other movements worth exploring as well. I intend to make more videos exploring more into things like sacred music, rhythm and blues, and Latin. But for now, I hope this had some good information, and do subscribe if you're interested in seeing more. Until then, have a dynamite time!